Margaret Henderson woke up that Tuesday morning like any other day. She made her coffee, checked the weather, and walked to her front window to see what was happening on Elm Street. For 37 years, this had been her routine. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every tree that needed trimming, and most importantly, every single car that belonged in her neighborhood. But today something was different, something that made her stop mid-sip of her morning coffee. There, parked, right across from the Thompson house, sat a car she had never seen before. It wasn't just any car either. This thing looked like it meant business. The black paint was so perfect it seemed to glow in the morning light. The windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see inside at all. And there was something about the way it sat there, so still and official looking, that made her stomach feel uneasy. Margaret had lived through enough changes in Maplewood to know when something didn't fit. She remembered when the neighborhood was all young families with kids riding bikes in the streets. Now most of those kids had grown up and moved away, leaving behind their parents who drove sensible cars and kept to themselves. This mysterious, black car didn't belong to that world. She tried to go about her morning routine, but her eyes kept drifting back to that window. Every few minutes she found herself peeking through the curtains, hoping the car would be gone. But it wasn't. It just sat there, looking more suspicious with each passing hour. The Thompson house had been quiet lately. Betty and Harold Thompson were visiting their daughter in Florida, something they did every winter. But their nephew Jake was staying there, keeping an eye on things. Margaret had met Jake a few times when he visited. He seemed like a nice enough young man, always polite when he waved from across the street. He worked as a mechanic somewhere in town, if she remembered correctly. But this car didn't look like something a mechanic would drive. This looked like something a detective would use. Or maybe someone pretending to be a detective. By Wednesday morning, the car was still there. Margaret found herself making extra trips to her mailbox just to get a better look. She noticed things that made her even more worried. There were extra antennas on the roof, thin black ones that seemed designed not to be noticed. The license plate looked official, but she couldn't quite make out all the numbers from her house. During her afternoon walk, she made sure to pass by the Thompson house. Up close, the car looked even more professional. The chrome was polished to perfection. The tires looked expensive, the kind that probably cost more than most people spent on car payments. And those windows, they were tinted so dark it had to be illegal for a regular person to drive around like that. Margaret had watched enough crime shows to know that sometimes bad people used official-looking cars to trick people. What if Jake had gotten himself mixed up with the wrong crowd? What if this wasn't even Jake's car? What if someone was using the empty Thompson house for something illegal while the owners were away? Her mind started racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Drug dealers sometimes used fancy cars to make themselves look legitimate. Identity thieves used official-looking vehicles to gain people's trust. She had read stories online about criminals who would park in quiet neighborhoods watching and planning. By Thursday morning, Margaret couldn't take it anymore. She had barely slept, worrying about what that car represented. Every time she looked out her window and saw it sitting there, so perfect and mysterious, her anxiety grew stronger. She decided to do something she had never done before in all her years of neighborhood watching. She was going to take pictures. Margaret grabbed her phone and tried to be sneaky about it, standing behind her living room curtains and zooming in as much as possible. But her hands were shaking, and the pictures came out blurry. She tried again, this time from her bedroom window upstairs, which gave her a better angle. Through her phone screen, she could see details that made her even more concerned. There were small lights mounted near the mirrors that looked like they could flash red and blue. The antenna system was more complex than she had first noticed, and there was definitely some kind of equipment mounted inside that she could barely make out through the dark glass. Margaret sat on her bed staring at the blurry photos on her phone, trying to decide what to do next. She had always been the type of person who minded her own business, but she also cared deeply about her neighborhood. She had organized block parties, kept an eye on everyone's houses during vacations, and always made sure new neighbors felt welcome. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. She thought about calling Betty Thompson in Florida, but what would she say? "Hi, Betty. Your nephew might be involved with criminals. That seemed cruel and probably wrong. Jake had always seemed like such a good kid. Then she thought about just walking over and asking Jake directly about the car. But what if she was right about her suspicions? What if approaching him put her in danger? At 72 years old, Margaret wasn't as brave as she used to be. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she needed to call the authorities. Not 911. This wasn't exactly an emergency. But the police should know about this car and make sure everything was legitimate. Margaret spent the rest of Thursday watching the car and building up her courage. She saw Jake come and go a few times, and he looked normal enough. But the car looked so out of place on their quiet street. It belonged in a government parking lot or outside a police station, not in front of a modest 2-story house where retired teachers and elderly widows lived. That evening, as the sun was setting and the mysterious black car seemed to absorb all the remaining light, Margaret made her decision. She was going to call the police first thing in the morning. She had to protect her neighborhood, even if it meant being wrong about a nice young man. She spent one more restless night, getting up every few hours to check if the car was still there. Each time she looked, there it was, sitting in the same spot like a silent guardian or a patient predator. By morning, Margaret's mind was made up completely. Something had to be done about that car, and she was the only one brave enough to do it. Friday morning came with a gray sky that matched Margaret's mood perfectly. She had tossed and turned all night, checking the clock every hour. By 5 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and made herself a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The black car was still there, of course. It seemed to be mocking her now, sitting so calmly while her nerves were completely shot. Margaret had made her decision during those long, sleepless hours. She was going to call the police, but she wanted to do it right. She wasn't some paranoid old lady calling about every little thing. She was a concerned citizen with legitimate worries. First, she needed to gather her thoughts and maybe some evidence. Margaret pulled out a notebook she used for grocery lists and started writing down everything she had observed. The car had been there since Tuesday. That was 4 days now. Jake came and went at odd hours, sometimes very early in the morning or late at night. The car never moved during the day, just sat there like it was waiting for something. She wrote down her observations about the antennas, the dark windows, and those lights she was pretty sure she had seen near the mirrors. Margaret even sketched a rough drawing of the car, though she admitted to herself that art had never been her strong suit. By 8 o'clock, Margaret figured it was late enough to make her call. She had looked up the non-emergency number for the police department online, writing it down carefully on a piece of paper. Her hands were shaking slightly as she dialed, but her voice was steady when someone answered. Maplewood Police Department. This is Officer Mills speaking. How can I help you? The voice was professional but friendly, which made Margaret feel a little better about making the call. She took a deep breath and tried to sound as calm and reasonable as possible. Hello, Officer Mills. My name is Margaret Henderson and I live on Elm Street. I'd like to report a suspicious vehicle that's been parked in my neighborhood for several days. Okay, Mrs. Henderson. Can you tell me more about what makes this vehicle suspicious? Margaret had practiced this conversation in her head, but now that it was really happening, the words came tumbling out faster than she intended. Well, it's this black car with very dark windows, and it looks like some kind of official vehicle. It has extra antennas and what I think might be emergency equipment. It's been parked outside the Thompson house for 4 days straight, and it just doesn't belong in our neighborhood. Officer Mills was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could hear typing in the background. Can you describe the vehicle in more detail? Make, model, color, license plate if you can see it. It's black, very shiny and new-looking. I'm not good with car makes and models, but it's a 4-door sedan. The license plate looks official, but I can't read all the numbers from my house. The windows are tinted so dark I can't see inside at all. Margaret was warming up now, feeling more confident about her decision to call. Officer Mills was taking her seriously, asking all the right questions, and you mentioned extra antennas and emergency equipment. Can you be more specific about what you've observed? There are several thin black antennas on the roof that you wouldn't normally see on a regular car, and I'm pretty sure I saw some kind of lights mounted near the side mirrors that could be used for flashing. The whole thing just looks too professional. For a civilian vehicle, Officer Mills asked for the exact address and Margaret's contact information. Then came the question Margaret had been dreading. Do you know who's been driving this vehicle? Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to get Jake in trouble if she was wrong, but she also couldn't lie to the police. The Thompson family who lives there is visiting their daughter in Florida. Their nephew Jake is staying at the house while they're away. He's a young man, maybe in his 20s, works as a mechanic, I think. But this car doesn't look like something a mechanic would normally drive. What makes you think that? Well, it's just so expensive looking and official, like something an undercover police officer or government agent would use. I'm worried that either this young man is impersonating law enforcement or maybe he's gotten involved with something illegal. I've lived in this neighborhood for 37 years, Officer Mills, and I know what belongs here and what doesn't. Officer Mills assured Margaret that they would send someone to investigate. She explained that impersonating a police officer was indeed a serious crime, as was operating a vehicle with illegal modifications designed to look official. We'll have an officer come by within the next few hours to take a look at the situation. Can you be available if they need to speak with you? Oh yes, absolutely. I'll be home all day. Should I try to get better pictures of the car? Don't put yourself at risk, but if you can safely take photos from your own property, that would be helpful. Don't approach the vehicle or the individual. Just document what you can see. After hanging up, Margaret felt both relieved and nervous. She had done the right thing by calling, but now she was committed to this course of action. There was no taking it back. She spent the next hour trying to get better pictures with her phone. The morning light was better than her previous attempts, and she managed to capture several clear shots of the car from different angles. She could clearly see the antenna array on the roof and what definitely looked like additional lighting equipment. Margaret also took pictures of the license plate, though she still couldn't make out all the characters clearly. She wrote down what she could see and noted the time and date of each photo. Around 10 o'clock, she saw Jake come out of the house and walk toward the mysterious car. Margaret quickly grabbed her phone and watched through her window as he opened the door. She couldn't see much because of the tinted windows, but she noticed that he seemed very comfortable with the vehicle, like he had been driving it for a while. Jake sat in the car for several minutes without starting it. Margaret wondered what he was doing in there. Was he talking on a radio? Checking some kind of equipment? Planning something? After about 10 minutes, Jake got out of the car and went back into the house. The car remained parked and silent, giving no clues about its secrets. Margaret made herself a sandwich for lunch but found she had no appetite. She kept checking the clock and looking out the window, waiting for the police to arrive. Part of her hoped they would come soon and resolve everything. Another part of her worried that she was about to make a fool of herself in front of the whole neighborhood. What if Jake really was just a mechanic who happened to own a nice car? What if she was completely wrong about everything? But then she would look at those photos on her phone, and all her doubts would disappear. That car was definitely not normal, and someone needed to find out why. By noon, Margaret had positioned herself in her living room with a clear view of both the street and the Thompson house. She had her notebook ready, her phone charged, and her courage firmly in place. Whatever was about to happen, she was ready for it. The black car sat there waiting, keeping its secrets for just a little while longer. Margaret was halfway through her third cup of coffee when she saw them. 2 police cars rolled slowly down Elm Street, their presence immediately changing the entire atmosphere of the quiet neighborhood. Her heart started beating faster, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over her at the same time. The first car stopped directly behind the mysterious black sedan, while the second one parked a little further down the street. Margaret watched from her living room window as 2 officers got out of the first car. They were both wearing standard uniforms, and they moved with the careful confidence that comes from years of experience. One officer was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his 40s with graying hair at his temples. The other was younger and smaller, a woman who looked like she could handle herself in any situation. They stood next to their car for a moment, talking quietly while looking at the black sedan that had caused all this trouble. Margaret felt a strange sense of pride mixed with nervousness. She had been right to call. The way the officers were studying the car, taking their time to observe it before approaching, told her that they were taking this seriously. This wasn't just some worried neighbor making a fuss about nothing. The officers walked around the mysterious car slowly, examining it from different angles. Margaret could see them pointing at various features: the antennas, the tinted windows, the unusual chrome details she had noticed. They were confirming everything she had reported, which made her feel vindicated but also more anxious about what they might discover. Then something unexpected happened. The front door of the Thompson house opened, and Jake stepped out onto the porch. He was wiping his hands on an old rag, and there were grease stains on his work clothes. He looked like he had been working on something in the garage, completely unaware that police officers were examining his car. When Jake noticed the police cars, his expression changed from casual to confused. He walked down the porch steps slowly, his head tilted like he was trying to figure out what was going on. Margaret held her breath as she watched the scene unfold from her window. The older officer approached Jake first, his hand resting casually near his belt in a way that looked relaxed but ready. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see Jake's body language. He didn't look guilty or nervous. He looked genuinely puzzled, like someone who had no idea why the police would be interested in him. The conversation lasted several minutes. Jake kept gesturing toward his car, then toward the Thompson house, then back to his car again. At one point, he pulled something out of his pocket, probably his wallet or some kind of identification, and showed it to the officers. Margaret was practically glued to her window now, trying to read the situation from the movements and expressions she could observe. The younger officer had walked over to examine the car more closely, while her partner continued talking with Jake. She was taking photos with her phone and making notes in a small notebook. Then Jake did something that surprised everyone. He started walking toward his car with obvious enthusiasm, like he was excited to show the officers something. He wasn't acting like someone who had been caught doing something illegal. He was acting like someone who was proud of something and wanted to share it. The officers followed Jake to his car, and Margaret watched as he opened the driver's side door. Even from across the street, she could see that the interior looked different from a normal car. There were extra displays and controls that didn't belong in a regular vehicle. This seemed to confirm her suspicions that the car was some kind of special or official vehicle. But Jake's behavior still didn't make sense if he was trying to impersonate a police officer. He was pointing things out to the officers like he was giving them a tour. He opened the hood of the car, and all three of them leaned in to look at whatever was under there. Margaret couldn't see what they were looking at, but she could see their reactions. The officers went from professionally cautious to clearly surprised. The older officer straightened up and looked at Jake with what appeared to be respect rather than suspicion. The younger officer was taking more photos and asking questions that Jake seemed happy to answer. More neighbors were starting to notice the commotion. Mrs. Chen from next door had come out to get her mail and was lingering by her mailbox, obviously curious about the police presence. Old Mr. Patterson from down the street was pretending to work in his garden while stealing glances at the scene. Margaret felt a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. The officers weren't acting like they had caught someone breaking the law. They were acting like they had discovered something interesting and impressive. But what could that possibly be? Jake disappeared into the Thompson house for a few minutes and came back carrying a thick folder full of papers. He spread some documents out on the hood of a police car, and the officers examined them carefully. Margaret wished she could hear what they were talking about, but she was too far away and too nervous to go outside. The younger officer made a phone call, probably back to the station. Margaret wondered if they were running some kind of check on Jake or his car. The call lasted about 5 minutes, during which Jake continued showing the older officer different features of his mysterious vehicle. When the phone call ended, the atmosphere seemed to shift again. The officers were no longer treating this as a potential crime scene. They were treating it more like a discovery, something unusual and noteworthy rather than suspicious and dangerous. Jake seemed to be explaining something complex, using his hands to gesture and pointing to different parts of his car. The officers were asking questions and taking notes, but their body language had completely changed from when they first arrived. They looked impressed rather than concerned. Margaret realized that whatever was happening wasn't what any of them had expected. Jake wasn't a criminal pretending to be a police officer. His car wasn't stolen government property or some kind of illegal modification designed to fool people. But if that was true, then what was it? The older officer walked over to the second police car and had a brief conversation with whoever was inside. Margaret hadn't realized there was a third officer, but apparently they had backup stationed down the street, just in case the situation turned dangerous. After about 45 minutes of examination, conversation, and documentation, the officers seemed to be wrapping up their investigation. Jake was smiling and shaking hands with both officers like they were congratulating him on something. The younger officer handed him her business card, which seemed like an unusual end to what Margaret had thought would be an arrest. As the police cars prepared to leave, Margaret found herself in an awkward position. She had called them here, but she still didn't know what they had discovered. She didn't know if she should feel embarrassed for making the call or vindicated for being right that the car was unusual. The older officer walked across the street toward her house, and Margaret's heart started racing again. She quickly moved away from the window, not wanting to appear like she had been spying the whole time, even though that was exactly what she had been doing. The doorbell rang, and Margaret took a deep breath before answering it. Margaret opened her front door with shaky hands, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the officer could hear it. The older policeman stood on her porch with a gentle smile that immediately put her somewhat at ease, though she still felt embarrassed about the whole situation. "Mrs. Henderson? I'm Officer Rodriguez from the Maplewood Police Department. You're the one who called about the suspicious vehicle?" "Yes, that's me," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope I didn't waste your time. I was just worried about the neighborhood, you know." Officer Rodriguez chuckled softly and shook his head. "Ma'am, you definitely didn't waste our time. In fact, you've helped us discover something pretty remarkable. Would you mind if I explained what we found over there?" Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least she wasn't in trouble for making a false report. She invited Officer Rodriguez to sit on her porch, and he settled into one of her wicker chairs like he had all the time in the world. "First off, Mrs. Henderson, your instincts were absolutely correct. That car is definitely not your typical vehicle. You were right to notice that it looked official and different from anything else in the neighborhood." Margaret felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just some paranoid old lady after all. Her years of watching the neighborhood had taught her to spot when something didn't belong. "But here's the thing," Officer Rodriguez continued. "Jake Martinez isn't impersonating a police officer or involved in anything illegal. What he's done is actually pretty incredible. That young man has built himself a completely electric car from scratch." Margaret blinked in confusion. "Electric? Like those expensive cars they sell at the fancy dealerships?" "Not exactly like those, ma'am. Those are made by big companies with millions of dollars in research and development. Jake built his car in his aunt and uncle's garage, using parts he bought himself and modifications he designed with his own two hands." Officer Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed Margaret some of the photos his partner had taken. Even on the small screen, Margaret could see that the engine compartment looked nothing like any car she had ever seen before. See? Instead of a regular gas engine, Jake installed this electric motor system. All those antennas you noticed, they're not for police communications. They're part of a GPS and monitoring system he built to track how efficiently his car runs. Margaret studied the photos, trying to understand what she was looking at. But it looked so professional, so official. I was sure it had to be some kind of government car. "That's exactly what impressed us so much," Officer Rodriguez explained. "The reason it looks so professional is because Jake did such an amazing job building it. He's been working on this project for over a year, and he's documented everything perfectly. He showed us permits, inspection certificates, registration paperwork, everything completely legal and above board." Margaret felt her cheeks turning red with embarrassment. "So I called the police on a young man who was just working on his hobby?" "Mrs. Henderson, don't feel bad about this. What Jake has accomplished is so unusual and impressive that it makes perfect sense you'd think something official was going on. Most people who convert cars to electric power don't do such a professional job. Jake's car looks like it could have come from a high-end manufacturer." Officer Rodriguez showed her more photos on his phone, explaining what Jake had shown them under the hood. There were custom battery packs, cooling systems, and computer controls that Jake had either built himself or carefully modified to work together. The equipment you thought might be emergency lights, that's actually part of his charging system and diagnostic displays. Jake mounted them where he could easily access them to monitor how his car is performing. Margaret shook her head in amazement. I had no idea someone could do something like that. How does a young mechanic learn to build something so complicated? Well, it turns out Jake isn't just any mechanic. He studied electrical engineering in college before he started working on cars. This project combines both his interests, mechanical work and electrical systems. He's basically created a masterpiece of automotive engineering in his spare time. Officer Rodriguez explained that Jake had spent his entire savings from his mechanic job on this project. Every weekend for 18 months, he had worked in the Thompson's garage, carefully planning and building each component of his electric car conversion. The reason the car never moved during the day was because Jake was still making final adjustments. He told us he only drives it early in the morning, or late at night when there's less traffic, just to be extra safe while he's testing everything. Margaret thought back to all the times she had seen Jake coming and going at odd hours. She had assumed he was up to something suspicious, but really, he was just being responsible about testing his creation. What about those official-looking license plates? Margaret asked. Completely legitimate. When you convert a car to electric power, you have to register it with the state and get special documentation. Jake's plates are marked to show that his car meets all the requirements for a custom electric vehicle. Officer Rodriguez stood up and stretched, clearly impressed by what he had learned. Mrs. Henderson, in 20 years of police work, I've never seen anything quite like what that young man has accomplished. My partner already asked for his contact information because her husband is interested in learning about electric car conversions. Margaret felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and pride. She was embarrassed that she had misjudged Jake so badly, but she was also proud that her neighborhood was home to someone so talented and innovative. What happens now? She asked. Is Jake angry with me for calling the police? Officer Rodriguez laughed. Actually, Jake seemed pretty excited that someone noticed his hard work. He said most people just drive by without realizing what they're looking at. He wasn't upset at all. He was more interested in explaining how everything worked. As Officer Rodriguez prepared to leave, he turned back to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. You know, Mrs. Henderson, Jake mentioned that he's been thinking about teaching other people how to do electric car conversions. Maybe this whole situation will encourage him to share his knowledge with the community. Margaret watched as the police cars drove away, leaving the street quiet once again. But now when she looked at Jake's black car, she saw it completely differently. Instead of a suspicious vehicle that didn't belong, she saw a remarkable achievement by a young man with incredible skill and dedication. She thought about all the assumptions she had made over the past few days. Jake working at odd hours, the professional appearance of his car, the unusual equipment she had observed. Everything had a perfectly innocent and actually impressive explanation. As Margaret sat on her porch in the afternoon sun, she realized that this experience had taught her something important about jumping to conclusions. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen right in your own neighborhood, and they might look suspicious simply because they're so far beyond what you expect to see. The mysterious black car was still there, but now it represented something wonderful instead of something worrying. Margaret found herself looking forward to talking with Jake and learning more about his incredible project. After Officer Rodriguez left, Margaret sat on her porch for a long time, staring at Jake's car with completely new eyes. The sleek black vehicle that had caused her so much worry now looked like a symbol of innovation and hard work. She felt terrible about misjudging Jake, but she also felt amazed that such incredible talent existed right across the street from her. That evening, Margaret did something she rarely did. She walked across the street and knocked on the Thompsons' front door. When Jake answered, he was still wearing his work clothes with grease under his fingernails and a friendly smile on his face. Hi, Mrs. Henderson. The police officer told me you were the one who called about my car. I hope I didn't worry you too much. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Jake, I owe you a huge apology. I completely misjudged your car and your character. I had no idea you had built something so amazing. Jake's smile grew wider. Don't apologize. Actually, I'm kind of flattered that someone finally noticed all the work I put into it. Most people just see a black car and keep driving. You're the first person who realized it was something special, even if you weren't sure what. They talked for over an hour on the Thompsons' front porch. Jake explained his project in simple terms that Margaret could understand. He had always been fascinated by electric cars but couldn't afford to buy one, so he decided to build his own. He showed her photos on his phone of the conversion process, from the day he bought the regular gas-powered car to the moment he successfully drove it on electric power for the first time. The hardest part wasn't the technical stuff, Jake explained. It was convincing people that I wasn't crazy. My family thought I was wasting my money on an impossible dream. My friends at the shop thought I should just buy a regular car like everyone else. Margaret listened to his story with growing admiration. This young man had spent 18 months working alone in a garage, solving problems that would challenge professional engineers, all because he believed in his vision of sustainable transportation. Word about Jake's electric car spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church social. By the weekend, Margaret noticed people driving slowly past the Thompson house, trying to get a better look at the mysterious vehicle that had attracted police attention. Mrs. Chen from next door was the first to actually stop and ask questions. She knocked on Margaret's door Sunday morning, curious about what had really happened with all those police cars. I heard it was some kind of misunderstanding, Mrs. Chen said. But what was so special about that car that it needed police investigation? Margaret found herself telling the story with enthusiasm, proud to share Jake's achievement with anyone who would listen. He built an electric car from scratch, can you imagine? That young man took a regular car and turned it into something that runs entirely on electricity. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. He built it himself, that's incredible. My nephew in California paid $50,000 for an electric car last year. Word continued to spread, and by the following week, neighbors were finding excuses to walk past the Thompson house. Margaret noticed Mr. Patterson spending an unusual amount of time working in his front yard, which gave him a perfect view of Jake's car. The young family 3 houses down made a point of walking their dog past the car every evening. Margaret realized that the neighborhood was genuinely interested in Jake's project, not just curious about the police drama. She decided to do something about it. That Thursday, Margaret knocked on Jake's door again, this time with a proposal. Jake, I've been thinking. A lot of our neighbors are curious about your car, but they're too shy to ask you directly. Would you be interested in showing it off properly? Maybe we could have a little neighborhood gathering? Jake's face lit up. You mean like a demonstration? I'd love that. I've been wanting to share what I learned, but I wasn't sure anyone would be interested. Margaret organized a neighborhood barbecue for the following Saturday. She put flyers in everyone's mailbox explaining that Jake would be demonstrating his electric car conversion and answering questions about sustainable transportation. She was amazed by the response. Nearly every family on the street said they would attend. The day of the barbecue was perfect. Clear skies, warm weather, and more neighbors than Margaret had seen together since the annual block party 5 years ago. Jake had spent the morning preparing for his presentation, printing out charts and photos that showed the conversion process step by step. When the time came for the demonstration, Jake opened the hood of his car and began explaining his project to a crowd of fascinated neighbors. He spoke clearly and simply, making sure everyone could understand the basics of how electric motors work and why he had chosen to build his own car instead of buying one. The most important thing I learned, Jake told the group, is that you don't need a huge corporation or millions of dollars to make a difference. One person with dedication and the right knowledge can create something amazing. The questions came fast and enthusiastically. How long did it take? How much did it cost? How far can it drive on a single charge? Where did he learn to do electrical work? Jake answered everything patiently, clearly enjoying the chance to share his passion with others. Old Mr. Patterson surprised everyone by asking the most technical questions. It turned out he had been an engineer before retiring, and he was genuinely impressed by Jake's problem-solving skills and attention to detail. "Young man," Mr. Patterson said, "what you've accomplished here is graduate-level engineering work. Have you considered teaching others how to do this? Jake blushed at the compliment. I've thought about it, but I'm not sure where I'd even start. That's when Mrs. Chen spoke up. She worked as an administrator at the community college and had been listening to Jake's explanation with growing excitement. Jake, our school has been looking for someone to teach workshops on green technology and sustainable transportation. Would you be interested in talking to our continuing education department? Margaret watched Jake's face transform as he realized the possibilities. Teaching others about electric car conversion could turn his hobby into something much bigger and more meaningful. The barbecue continued until sunset, with neighbors taking turns sitting in Jake's car, examining the custom controls, and asking for rides around the block. Margaret had never seen the community so engaged and excited about anything. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a hand-delivered invitation to Jake's first electric vehicle workshop at the community college. The class was already full, with a waiting list of people wanting to learn about sustainable transportation. As Margaret sat in the back of the classroom, watching Jake confidently explain electrical systems to a room full of eager students, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her worried phone call to the police had led to something wonderful for both Jake and the entire community. Jake had found his calling as a teacher and advocate for sustainable technology. The community college was so impressed with his first workshop that they offered him a part-time position developing their green technology curriculum. 6 months later, Jake's influence had spread far beyond Elm Street. 3 neighbors had started their own electric vehicle conversion projects with Jake as their mentor. The local newspaper wrote a feature story about the neighborhood genius who was teaching sustainable transportation one car at a time. Margaret kept the newspaper clipping on her refrigerator, right next to a photo from the neighborhood barbecue. Every time she looked at it, she smiled, remembering how a simple misunderstanding had led to such wonderful discoveries about talent, community, and the power of supporting one another's dreams.